For 30 years, nobody suspected him. He drove the same roads every morning. He went to the same office. He fixed the same problems, signed the same paperwork, ate lunch at the same places. He had a wife. He had children. He had neighbors who waved to him when they took out the trash. He was the kind of man who blended so completely into the fabric of ordinary suburban life that nobody, not his family, not his colleagues, not the investigators who spent years searching for a killer, ever thought to look at him twice. His name was Rex Heuermann. He was a 62-year-old architect from Massapequa Park, a quiet suburb on Long Island, New York. And on the 8th of April 2026, he stood in a courtroom and admitted, calmly and without visible emotion, that he had strangled 8 women to death, that he had wrapped their bodies in burlap, that he had driven them to a remote stretch of coastline called Gilgo Beach and left them there in the dark, one by one, over the course of nearly 3 decades. 8 women, 17 years of killing, and not a single person who knew him had any idea. But here is the detail that will stay with you long after this video ends. When investigators finally broke open this case, they did not do it with a tip, or a confession, or a witness coming forward. They did it with a pizza crust. A discarded piece of pizza crust, pulled from the trash outside his Manhattan office, contained enough DNA to link him to the victims. The man who had spent almost 30 years believing he was invisible had been undone by something he threw away without a second thought. This is the story of the Gilgo Beach serial killer, and it is unlike anything you have heard before. To understand this story properly, you need to start not with Rex Heuermann, but with the night that everything began to unravel. December 11, 2010. A police officer responding to an unrelated call on Ocean Parkway, a remote, windswept stretch of road running along the southern shore of Long Island, discovered something in the brush along the side of the road. Human remains. A woman wrapped in burlap, bound and discarded like something left out for collection. Her name was Melissa Barthelemy. She was 24 years old. She had been missing since 2009. Investigators returned to search the surrounding area more thoroughly. And then they found another, and another, and another. Within weeks, sets of remains had been discovered along the same stretch of coastline near Gilgo Beach. All young women, all bound in a similar manner, all wrapped in burlap, all connected to the sex industry in New York City. The press named them the Gilgo for Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Bartz. They had all gone missing between 2007 and 2010. They had all been advertising their services online, and they had all, at some point in the final hours of their lives, met the same man. The discovery sent shockwaves through Long Island and beyond. Investigators expanded the search. Over the following year, the remains of nearly a dozen individuals were found in the surrounding area, some in burlap, some not, some dismembered, some only partially identified. It was the largest discovery of potential serial killer victims on the American East Coast in decades. And then, for almost 12 years, the investigation stalled. No arrest. No identified suspect. No answers for the families of the women who had been left in that sand. The case went cold in the public eye, even as a dedicated task force continued working behind the scenes. Investigators built and discarded theories. They interviewed hundreds of people. They tested thousands of DNA samples. They followed leads that went nowhere. Meanwhile, the man responsible for all of it was going to work every day in Manhattan. Rex Heuermann had built a successful career as an architect. His firm, RH Consultants and Associates, operated out of a midtown Manhattan office and handled projects across New York and beyond. He was known in professional circles as knowledgeable and experienced, a man who had spent decades working in a demanding, detail-oriented field that required precision, patience, and methodical thinking. At home in Massapequa Park, he presented as a quiet, somewhat reclusive figure. His neighbors described him as a large man. He stood around 6'4" and was physically imposing, but largely unremarkable. He kept to himself. He was not the kind of neighbor who came over for barbecues or stopped to chat at the mailbox. His wife, Asa Ellerup, ran a business of her own. They had 2 children together. The house was a large property, a place with enough space that, investigators would later discover, its interior contained secrets that the quiet street outside could never have imagined. Because underneath the ordinary surface, Rex Heuermann had been living a hidden life for the entirety of his adult existence. Using aliases and burner phones, disposable devices he purchased deliberately to avoid being traced, he had spent years contacting women who advertised escort services online. He communicated with dozens of them. He arranged meetings. And according to the evidence that prosecutors compiled over years of investigation, those meetings, for at least 8 women, ended in their deaths. But there was more to the hidden life than the killings themselves. On the devices investigators recovered from Heuermann after his 2023 arrest, they found thousands of files, a collection of torture pornography that prosecutors described as extensive and deeply disturbing. They found the aliases he had used to contact victims. They found records of his communications. And they found something that made investigators stop cold, a document they referred to in court as a blueprint. This was not a casual note. This was a formal, methodically organized planning document. It outlined strategies for future killings. It described how to approach victims, how to avoid leaving DNA evidence, how to dispose of a body, and what supplies would be needed to carry out a murder. It included reminders he had written to himself, clinical, precise notations, as if he were planning a construction project rather than a human life. One of the reminders read, "Consider a hit to the neck next time." This was a man who thought about murder the way other people think about logistics. Carefully, systematically, with attention to detail and an eye on improvement. And for nearly 3 decades, it had worked. The break in the Gilgo Beach case did not come from a confession, a witness, or a tip. It came from a combination of new technology, painstaking investigative work, and a critical piece of physical evidence that Rex Heuermann discarded without a second thought. In 2022, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office assembled a dedicated task force specifically focused on the Gilgo Beach murders. This was not the first time investigators had taken a fresh run at the case, but this time they had tools that had not existed when the bodies were first found. The first breakthrough came through vehicle records. A witness had reported seeing a distinctive pickup truck, a Chevrolet Avalanche, a model that was relatively uncommon on Long Island, near the area where one of the victims had last been seen in 2010. Investigators ran the vehicle registration database and identified a small number of Chevrolet Avalanches registered in the surrounding area. One of them belonged to Rex Heuermann. That single match opened the door. Investigators began building a surveillance operation around Heuermann without alerting him. They monitored him carefully. They tracked his movements. They pulled cell phone data that showed his phone had been in the same locations as some of the victims just before they disappeared. They used a technique called cell site analysis to map his movements over the relevant periods, and the pattern that emerged aligned with the timeline of the killings in ways that were difficult to explain as coincidence. But the most critical piece of evidence came from DNA. Forensic scientists had extracted DNA from a hair found in the burlap used to wrap some of the victims. The profile did not match anyone in existing databases. Investigators needed a fresh DNA sample from Heuermann to make a direct comparison, and they needed to collect it without his knowledge, without triggering a search warrant that might alert him to the investigation. So they watched, and they waited. And one day, Rex Heuermann threw away a pizza crust outside his Manhattan office. Investigators retrieved it from the rubbish. The DNA extracted from that discarded piece of food matched the profile on the burlap. The man who had spent nearly 30 years believing he had covered his tracks, who had planned his crimes with a blueprint, who had used burner phones, who had worked meticulously to leave no trace, had been undone by something he tossed into a bin without a second thought. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested at his Massapequa Park home. He was charged with 3 murders. His attorney appeared before cameras the following morning and told reporters that Hoyerman had been in tears, that he had said he didn't do this. Within minutes of that statement, investigators had already identified him as the prime suspect in a fourth killing, and the charges would keep growing. When Rex Hoyerman was arrested in July 2023, his wife Asa Ellerup was on vacation in South Carolina with her daughter. She had no idea. By every account that emerged in the investigation, Ellerup was not just unaware of the killings, she was actively used as cover for them. Investigators found that Hoyerman had conducted many of his contacts with victims during periods when Ellerup and the children were out of the house or traveling. He had, in effect, used the structure of his family life, the schedules, the routines, the predictable absences, as a logistical framework for his crimes. In the days after the arrest, Ellerup filed for divorce. Her attorney confirmed that she and her daughter had no knowledge of or involvement in the killings. She released a brief statement saying her thoughts were with the victims and their families and asking for privacy. But the full weight of what she had lived alongside, unknowingly for decades, is difficult to fully grasp. She had shared a home, a bed, a life with a man who had been strangling women and leaving them in the sand on a nearby beach for the entirety of their marriage. Then, in April 2026, something extraordinary happened. Hoyerman's former wife agreed to participate in a documentary, a Peacock production called The Gilgo Beach Killer, House of Secrets. In a preview clip that was released days after his guilty plea, Ellerup described a supervised prison visit during which she asked Hoyerman directly how many women he had killed. He answered immediately. No hesitation. No emotion. Just the number. As if she had asked him how many floors were in a building. Now think about the 8 women he said that number represents. They were not abstractions. They were people. Melissa Barthélemy was 24 years old from upstate New York who had moved to the city to try to build a better life. Her younger sister had received phone calls after Melissa disappeared. The caller, investigators determined, was Hoyerman, calling from a burner phone and taunting the family, asking whether they missed her. Megan Waterman was 22 years old, a mother from Maine. She had traveled to New York for a brief period and never came home. Amber Lynn Costello was 27 years old, dealing with addiction and the difficulties that came with it, trying to survive in circumstances that left her vulnerable in ways that Hoyerman deliberately targeted. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was 25 years old and had a daughter she adored. Jessica Taylor was 20 years old when she disappeared in 2003. Her mother, Elizabeth Baxskiel, was in a courtroom when Hoyerman entered his guilty plea in April 2026. When it was over, she said she was glad it was finally finished, that it had taken a big chunk of stress off her family. Sandra Costilla had been killed in 1993, making her the earliest confirmed victim. Her remains were found more than 60 miles from Gilgo Beach in the Hamptons. Valerie Mack was killed in 2000. Her remains were found in 2 separate locations, one near Gilgo Beach, 145 miles away in Manaville, suggesting her body had been dismembered and disposed of across multiple sites. And Cara Vergata had disappeared in 1996. Her remains were found on Fire Island. For decades, her case sat in a cold case file with no connection to the Gilgo Beach investigation. It was only through the DNA work conducted by the task force that her death was finally linked to Hoyerman, a link he confirmed himself in open court when he admitted to causing her death as part of his plea. 8 women. The youngest was 20 years old. The oldest case went back to 1993. For some of these families, the wait for answers had lasted more than 30 years. On April 8, 2026, Rex Hoyerman appeared in Suffolk County Court in Riverhead, New York. He was dressed in a dark suit. His hands were shackled behind his back. The courtroom was packed. Victims' families, law enforcement officials, journalists, and the representatives of the women whose lives he had taken. He entered his guilty plea in a loud, confident voice. He did not look back at the gallery. He did not acknowledge the people sitting behind him whose lives he had destroyed. He answered each question from the judge with flat, precise responses. Yes, he had strangled each victim. Yes, he had used burner phones. Yes, he had wrapped some of them in burlap. Yes, he had dumped their bodies on Long Island. He appeared, by multiple accounts in the courtroom, completely unemotional. His attorney told the press afterward that the decision to plead guilty had been Hoyerman's own, that it had brought him, in his attorney's words, a huge sense of relief. For the families in that room, the word relief carried a very different weight. As part of the plea agreement, Hoyerman was required to cooperate with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the division responsible for studying serial killers in order to catch others. The DA's office confirmed that this cooperation was a central condition of the deal, and that investigators believe Hoyerman's knowledge and methodology could help identify patterns that might be relevant to other unsolved cases across the country. The question of whether there are other victims, women whose cases have never been connected to Hoyerman, whose families have never received the answers that the 8 confirmed families are now being given, remains unanswered. Investigators have said publicly that they believe Hoyerman's full history of violence may extend beyond the 8 admissions. His cooperation with the FBI is intended, at least in part, to help answer that question. Sentencing is scheduled for June 17, 2026. He faces multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. There's also the question of what investigators found inside the family home in Massapequa Park. During the search following his 2023 arrest, forensic teams spent weeks combing through the property. Prosecutors indicated at various stages of the pretrial proceedings that the interior of the house contained evidence that had not been fully disclosed to the public, evidence that suggested, according to prosecutors, that some of the crimes may have taken place inside the home itself rather than at another location. Those details have not been fully made public. They may emerge at sentencing. They may emerge through Hoyerman's cooperation with the FBI, or they may be details that take years to fully surface. What is already on the public record is disturbing enough. Rex Hoyerman lived next door to people for 30 years. He drove past schools. He ordered takeaway food. He went to client meetings and drew up building plans and came home to a house on a quiet street where children played in the gardens nearby. He was invisible not because he was clever, though his planning was methodical, but because of an assumption that most of us carry without realizing it. The assumption that the people around us, the ones we see every day, the ones who look and sound and act like everyone else, are exactly what they appear to be. 8 women pay for that assumption with their lives. Not because they were careless, not because they made mistakes, but because they encountered a man who had learned, over decades, how to present one face to the world while hiding something underneath it that no one was looking for. The investigators who finally caught him deserve enormous credit. The DNA technology that made it possible, the forensic genealogy tools, the nuclear DNA analysis, the painstaking work of the task force, represents some of the most important advances in law enforcement of the past decade. And the pizza crust that brought it all together is now, in its own strange way, one of the most consequential pieces of evidence in the history of American true crime. But what this case really asks of us is something harder than admiration for clever detective work. It asks us to sit with the discomfort of realizing that the most dangerous people are sometimes the most ordinary-looking ones. That predators do not always look like predators. That a man can stand in a courtroom after 30 years and admit to 8 murders in a confident voice with no visible emotion, and that the people who sat next to him at community events, who nodded to him in the car park, who shared the same roads and the same air, had no idea. Sentencing is June 17, 2026. When it happens, we will be back with a full update. If this case shook you, if there was a detail in this story you cannot stop thinking about, leave it in the comments. Tell me what got to you. And if you want the full update when Hoyerman is sentenced, subscribe right now so you do not miss it.